Well, before I start, I've got to extend my gratitude to the organizers, to Mukhtar particularly, who's invited me kindly to share some thoughts here with you tonight. And when you were reciting those verses from the Quran, I was reminded of a very interesting narrative from a renowned Muslim philosopher of medieval ages. And this is a piece from Akhlaq Nasiri, from Nasiruddin Tusi's Nasirian Ethics. And this is going to be very ironic. You probably have not heard about this, but when Tusi is talking about the education of women, he specifically says that women should not be educated. They should only be taught reading and writing, and that reading and writing is only specifically about the Quran. And even if it comes to the Quran, women should not be taught Surah Yusuf, because there is mention of love. And it's so ironic that you started in exactly the very same verses, which are so problematic for a medieval Muslim philosopher. But be that as it may, that was the standard narrative in medieval times for all Muslim thinkers. It was nothing very unusual. So, going back to what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, it's about the Ismaili Imamat's institutions and the ethical vision behind it. I have deliberately chosen to stay away from giving you a historical narrative, because history is available there. You can read books of history. I try to sort of make it a little bit more critical, intellectual, to give you a rather philosophical background to the whole story. So the presentation tonight is basically going to be divided into three parts. The first part is generally going to talk about the Al-Khan Development Network and the current institutions of the Ismaili Imamat. The second part deals with the issue of some issues of authority and how authority and leadership and Imamat is understood in the Ismaili community historically and until today. The third part is going to be a little bit more about emerging issues or contemporary matters, specifically specific topics that the Ismaili Imamat is looking at today. So, to give you some clarifications, we are basically, to give you who we are talking about, we are talking about the Ismaili community, which is the second largest Shia community after the Asnashari community in the world. The focus is on Nizari Ismailis. We are not going to talk about the early Ismailis, the Daryoush, who are in very small numbers in Lebanon and Syria. We're not going to talk about the Mustalian community who separated from the 8th Fatimid Caliph and Imam, who are today known as the Bora community, and you're most probably familiar with all of them. We are talking about the Nizari Ismailis, the people who followed the eldest son of Al-Mustansir Billah, the 8th Fatimid Caliph, and who moved to Iran, which are generally known as the Persian Ismailis, to whom the present Ismaili Imam is tracing his lineage, to Nizar ibn Musta'li. Now, this community is known legally as the Shia Imami Ismaili Muslims, as the constitution of the Ismailis today reads on the very title of it. And you almost know, everybody knows this, that they are the followers of Shah Karim al-Husayni Khan IV, who is the 49th hereditary Imam of this community. So the Nizari Ismailis are mainly scattered in over 25 countries around the globe. The largest concentration of Ismailis is in Afghanistan. I think we've got about over 2 million Ismailis in Afghanistan, which is a huge number. And then we've got Ismailis in Tajikistan, which is still the second largest popular concentration of Ismailis around the globe. And then we've got a lot in the subcontinent. The community who's generally known around the globe and associated with Ismailism today is the people who are generally from the subcontinent, mostly coming from East Africa, who are associated with the creation of the new contemporary modern institutions of the Ismaili community. So many people know them as very successful businessmen and entrepreneurs who are usually in Western countries in North America and in East Africa, and some of them in India. So this part is pretty much known to some of you already. So to give you an introduction to how the institutions of the Ismaili community and the Ismaili Imamat function, an important part of it has got to do with the role of the Imam, how the Imam is actually the present living Imam of this community, is situated at the top of these institutions. So The Ismaili Imam is providing this community and the institution with a vision and the leadership to giving the direction to the community in matters of their daily life for the improvement of the quality of their life and the quality of the life of the people amongst whom this community lives. So you see this very phrase, it sort of summarizes the entire ethical vision of the Ismaili Imamat, and I'll explain it in detail what I mean by that. Now, one of the other things that the Ismaili Imam does is that the Imam seeks to anticipate and address the vagaries of time. So what is going to happen in the future for the community in various areas, whether it's in social matters, in political matters, in economic issues. So the Imam is there to give advice to the community, but it's not just in matters of worldly and daily matters of their life. So going back to the early 20th century, at the time of Aga Khan III, Sultan Muhammad Shah, the world was witnessing far-reaching changes, radical changes in many socio-political issues, economic issues. Everybody knows about the two world wars, which was a period in which the Ismaili Imamat was also engaged at a high level in international service with the creation of the League of Nations, and the Ismaili Imam, the 48th Ismaili Imam, Aga Khan III, was the president of the League of Nations at one time. And it goes back to that time when the Ismaili Imamat is also engaged in international community, international services in the international institutions that we've got around there. So Aga Khan III started building these institutions for the community. There were a number of areas which were particularly important for the Imam, and it was education, it was economy. So many of you might have heard about the East African Ismailis, East African community which went from India to East Africa, and they started building their schools, their banks, their insurance companies, which was creating the background or the backbone of the current institutions. But what changed in the contemporary time when the present Imam became the Imam in 1957, he started expanding these institutions in many other areas which went far beyond what his grandfather had done. So when his grandfather was working, many of these institutions were primarily serving the Ismaili community. But during his time, these expanded and overflowed to serving other communities, other Muslim communities, and even non-Muslim communities. So it was basically, it became an agenda of development, meaning that it's got to do to improve the quality of people's life. So one of the important things that the Ismaili Imam was looking at today, he was looking at the emergent needs which the communities were actually dealing with. So what he did is that he built on the institutions that his grandfather had built, so it was no longer just in terms of just a school or an economic institution. They turned into larger institutions and started creating research institutions, academic institutions, universities, hospitals, on a more modern line, if you like. So under the leadership of the present Imam, these institutions became unified, and they came to be represented as the Aga Khan Development Network, which it started with the Aga Khan Foundation, and then they started building various institutions in the areas of culture, in education, in civil society. And we've got now a huge interconnected network of institutions with the primary purpose of improving the quality of life of the community. So these are working in the specific regions of the world. So the network is a mutually reinforcing institution, and they work in synergy. It's one of the most important things about the AKDN is that it's non-denominational. It serves the people it serves without regard for gender, for race, for the community in which they're coming from, or for their creed. So it's more than anything else a humanistic institution, which the common denominator is the common humanity of all people. Now, I've got a quotation from Aga Khan IV, the present Imam, which is, it sort of summarizes the perception or the self-image of the Ismaili Imam, of himself, of the community, and of the tradition which goes back to the time of the Prophet. So he summarizes his own role. It wouldn't be a surprise to you. Many of these ideas would be familiar to you, but there are a few important points in the way he speaks about his own role, which clarifies the specific situation and the location of the Ismaili Imam today in the 21st century. This is from a speech in the Canadian Parliament that he gave in 2014. He was invited to speak to both houses of the Parliament in Canada, and the text is there. I'm just giving you his own voice here as well, so you could hear it.
The Ismaili Imamat is a supranational entity representing the succession of Imams since the time of the Prophet. But let me clarify something more about the history of that role in both the Sunni and the Shia interpretations of the Muslim faith. The Sunni position is that the Prophet nominated no successor, and that spiritual moral authority belongs to those who are learned in matters of religious law. As a result, there are many Sunni Imams in a given time and in a given place. But others believed that the Prophet had designated his cousin and son-in-law, Ali, as his successor. From that early division, a host of further distinctions grew up. But the question of rightful leadership remains central. In time, the Shia were also subdivided over these questions, so that today the Ismailis are the only Shia community who throughout history have been led by a living hereditary Imam in direct descent from the Prophet. The role of the Ismaili Imam is a spiritual one. His authority is that of religious interpretation. It is not a political role. I do not govern any land. At the same time, Islam believes fundamentally that the spiritual and material worlds are inextricably connected. Faith does not remove Muslims or their Imams from daily practical matters in family life, in business, in community affairs.
As you can see from the way that the Imam is describing his own role, the major part of it is theological, doctrinal. It's something straightforward to all Shia Muslims. Everybody knows the theology and the doctrine behind it. The important point is the last few sentences that the Imam is saying that the role of the Imam is not simply limited to spiritual matters. Yeah, religion is there, interpretation of the faith for the community is there, but that does not mean that you should divorce the role of the Imam from all other aspects of life. At the same time, it's also not political, because maybe for an incident of history, the Imam does not govern any political territory. So he's not the head of a state, he doesn't govern any land, but that doesn't mean that you don't address areas of human life, day-to-day affairs of human life. So in a sense, he's trying to tell you that this is precisely what the Prophet was doing, because he was incidentally the head of a state, but he was more than anything else a supporter of the community, looking at the day-to-day matters of the life of the people. You couldn't say that I just interpret the Quran or give you message of something divine which has got to do with the hereafter, and you don't have anything to do with their worldly lives. So this last bit is summarizing the ethical vision of the drive of a Shi'i Ismaili Muslim Imam in the 21st century. The important point of that is that if you go back to the history of many Muslim communities, and the Imam, there is another quotation which I'm going to share with you, is that this is a Christian tendency, that you divorce the spiritual life from the material life, that they look at the world as something negative, as something sinful. And a large part of the history of our Sufi communities reflects that tendency, that you have to run away from the world, that it is something bad, that it is something sinful, that you have to avoid it in order to have a pure, clean life which is in line with the message given to the Prophet. Now, I'm sharing here a video with you which is giving you some facts and figures about the AKDN, and the reason I juxtapose this after exactly the quotation from the Imam is to give you an idea of how far that engagement with the material lives of members of the community and the people amongst whom they live has reached in the vision of the Imam, and how it has expanded so far. So it's in about 4 minutes. Okay, now with these, the figures that you saw and the images that you saw, what is the most immediate thing that comes to your mind? I mean, if somebody just looked at the way they presented the figures and the numbers of that, what is the most immediate thing which comes to your mind? It's about? Yeah, there's somebody here.
They helped lots of people.
Okay. What else? Diversity. But everybody's trying to look at the positive side. Now, the thing which is so prominent there is that you've got these huge numbers, the impact and the scope of it. And there's something very prominent there. They see it as generating money and spending money. Now, it's not just that. Many people, when they look at the Ahan, the Ismaili community, and the kind of services it provides, they see it as entrepreneurship or as charity. Now, this is the image that the Ismaili Imam all throughout his life and his Imamat has been trying to correct. And here is the passage of a quotation that we've got from him. In Tutzing, he was awarded the Tolerance Award by the Academy in Germany. And there he just raised this point that when the representatives of the Western media look at my work, look at the Ahan Development Network, look at what the community is doing, their perception is that this is some sort of philanthropy or entrepreneurship. And the Imam completely disagrees with that. He says that a philanthropist is just doing it because he's got extra money, he wants to spend the money. Or you're just creating job, generating money. I'm not doing that. I'm doing it precisely because I am the Imam of this community. And it's part of my role. The way I see my function is that you do not just address the spiritual and the religious aspects of people's life. You also pay attention to their material life, which is why the Ismaili Imamat thinks that there has got to be a balance between their religious life, between their dini life, and their dunyavi life. You cannot separate them. That is the driving mandate of the Ismaili Imam, which is that it flows from the mandate of the office of Imam to improve the quality of worldly life for the concerned communities. So it becomes something absolutely and utterly ethical. Now, to him, if you want to separate people's religious and faith community life from their material life, it is something unethical. Because you cannot say, okay, I go to mosque, I say my prayer, and then I go to do my business. It has, my business is not going to be influenced by the ethical way I look at my life, the entirety of my life. So they are interconnected. You cannot separate them. You cannot say that if I go make money, it is something bad, negative, sinful. You can be rich, but you can be ethical. You can have money, you can share your money. It's important how you earn your money and how you spend your money. So this perception of seeing the Imam's work as philanthropy or as entrepreneurship is something that the Imam is trying to correct in many ways, not just in words, but also in institutional action. Here is an extract from an interview that he had a couple of years ago in India. And the interviewer is asking him, isn't what you're doing charity? And his response is very straightforward. He says, yes, in Islam we have charity. It's very clear that charity is desirable, necessary, but the best form of charity is to enable an individual to manage their own destiny, to improve his condition of life or her condition of life so that they become autonomous. They make their own decisions. So the key thing behind the Afghan Development Network and what the Imamat is doing is to enable people to become masters of their own fate. The beneficiaries should not become completely dependent on the institutions. You just do not support them for 5, 10, 20 years forever. After a given time, these guys have got to be able to make their own living. They should be able to produce something in their own lives. They cannot constantly depend on you, because the moment you make people depend on you, you're doing something unethical to them. You're destroying them. You're robbing them of their autonomy, of their agency, of their individuality. You're not allowing them to flourish and prosper spiritually and materially. Now, some of the salient features of the work of the AKDN I've tried to summarize here is that it strengthens the role of the private sector rather than the public sector in the developing world. It works with the governments to create an enabling environment for development. And this development is actually the key translation for improving the quality of life. And improving the quality of life is, there are certain areas in it. You deal with education, you deal with economic development of people, you deal with culture, you deal with civil society, and there is literally not a single area of human life which is not covered by it, by improving the quality of life. And one of the most important things about the work of the AKDN is that there is a long-term commitment and engagement with the communities in which they work. The Ismaili Imam doesn't work like a venture capitalist. A capitalist would go, invest in a country, in a place, you make your own hotel, you make your own business, and then you get the money and just you leave the place. The Ismaili Imamat, throughout the past 50 years, wherever they have built something and created something, the Ismaili Imamat has stayed there for a very, very long time. If they build a hotel in Kabul in Afghanistan and then the Taliban attack it, it doesn't say, okay, it's enough. He's there to serve people and to stay there, and it's going to be a long-term one. You cannot say that I made my money, I'm going to leave this place. And particularly when we go back to the works of the Afghan Fund for Economic Development, in areas, for example, if you give the case of the Serena hotels, one of the basic principles of the production of the revenues is that the surplus you saw that in the video, is you have to spend it in the same country. You cannot say that, okay, I do something in Kenya, I make my own money, I take it out and I spend it in London or in Paris. You cannot do that. You're not allowed to do that, because it's just exploiting people. You've got to create jobs for the people of the same country, with the material in the same country, and the surplus has got to go back to the same country, because it's got to do with development and with developing and enhancing the civil society in that particular country. It's not about your own material profit-seeking. And the other thing is that it provides services which are needed by the community and wanted by the community. You cannot say that I make a decision for this community, I have decided, I have come to the conclusion that the people of this country are going to need this. It's not up to you. It's up to the community itself. They have got to know what they're looking for, and you've got to provide that for them. You've got to facilitate that for the people, for the agency of the people, for the autonomy of the same people. And the most important thing is that it's inspired by and grounded by the ethics of Islam. One of them I just shared with you, that you cannot just make people depend on you. It's very much important that you cannot undermine the autonomy and the independence of an individual human being, because you would damage their integrity. They would no longer be able to serve, to be as a human being and completely fulfill their own lives if you rob them of that autonomy. Now, talking about the ethical underpinnings of them is one of the most important ethical drives of the AKDN, which I mentioned it very briefly, is that you cannot separate deen and dunya. They have to work hand in hand with each other. You cannot have a good spiritual life if you live in poverty, if you live in disease. If you cannot have a good roof above your head, if you cannot wear good clothes, if you cannot get education, then there is no point about your spiritual life too. You cannot worship God properly if you don't live a proper life. It's very interesting that there is this story in Saadi's Bustan in which he talks about Daryoush, a Sufi, talking with a rich man. And then there is a debate between them. And then the guy says, look, you're a poor Sufi man. You don't have, you cannot just feed yourself and your own family, and you want to just pray. You cannot do 2 rakats of namaz with concentration, and you don't know anything about that. Every single moment that you're worshipping to God, you're worried, what am I going to eat tonight? What is my family going to do? You don't have anything. You don't have the money. You don't have clean money. You don't have a roof over your head. And that religiosity is always in trouble. So it's important, if you want to keep people faithful, make them happy, give them a good quality of life. It's very interesting that 7 centuries ago, somebody like Saadi realized the importance of paying attention to improving the quality of a person's life in order to keep them more faithful. It's a very famous tradition from the Prophet that wherever there is poverty, then blasphemy comes from the other door, heresy comes from the other door. قَادَ الْفَقْرُ أَن يَكُونَ كُفْرًا. It becomes kufr. And you've got to be very careful that you cannot keep people poor. So the values and ethics of faith are embedded in the very function, in the way these institutions are envisioned and in the way they work. So through the Imamat institutions, the Imam is highlighting the practical applications of how ethical ideals and values of Islam could actually be put in place. So you cannot just go there and preach people to be good people or to have a good, clean life. You have to give them the means and the platform upon which they could build an ethical life. So these institutions are necessary for that purpose. There is a lengthy document on the website of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, which is called the Akhan Development Network Ethical Frameworks. It gives certain areas, there are traditions by the Prophet, verses of the Quran, which sort of grounds the work of the Akhan Development Network in these ethical values of Islam. Now, I move on to this issue of authority and leadership, talking about the image and the perception of an imam. So if somebody asks you, what does an imam look like? What is the head of a religious community supposed to appear in the eyes of people? Just think for a few seconds. What does an imam look like? If you go all across the Muslim world and ask, not just a Muslim person, a non-Muslim person, what is their perception of the physical image of an imam? You would be surprised that there is such a common response. Everybody assumes that the head of a religious community, particularly of a Muslim community, has got to look in a particular way. There are some stereotypes there. Just search within yourself. You expect somebody to be a religious figure, to wear a turban, to have a long beard, to live in a particular way of life, to live in a particular place, geographical place. You see, authority is also attached, is joined by geographical locations. Well, everybody knows that Islam as a faith was never meant to be in a particular geographical location. The fact that the Prophet was born in Mecca or he died in Medina doesn't give any kind of value to that physical place in itself. That geographical location is not the point. It's something far bigger than that. This is the faith that the Quran describes as neither Western nor Eastern. This blessed olive tree is neither from the East nor from the West. But here I'm going to get a little bit academic to give you some perspective. I'm giving you these are the Weberian ideal types of authority. So Max Weber, a famous German sociologist, was saying that we've got 3 types of leadership, 3 ideal types for leadership and authority. One of them is the traditional figure, is the person or the leader who is constantly reminding the followers of the importance of the past, of the legacy of your forefathers and your foremothers, of why it is important to keep that alive and to protect it and preserve it. Now, this gentleman is Muhammad Burhanuddin, the former Da'i Mutlaq of the Bora community, who died a few years ago. In the Bora community, the Da'i Mutlaqs, who are supposed to be the representatives of the Imam who's in occultation from the Fatimid line, are in charge of protecting and preserving that legacy. And you would see that they generally look like this. Then we've got the charismatic leader. The charismatic leader or the charismatic position of authority is a position which demands the submission and the following of the people based on the magical, enigmatic qualities, the impressing qualities of the leader, that you could impress people, that people don't demand any explanation for what you do. They just follow you. They love you. Now this element of charisma is shared among religious leaders, among prophets, among, I don't know, politicians even. You could say that Hitler had that, Gandhi had that, and of course Ayatollah Khomeini is one of the most prominent figures in the 20th century who had this charismatic quality around him. Then we've got the bureaucratic, legal, rational bureaucratic leader who is telling people that, look, you guys should follow me because I've got all the files, I've got the cabinets, I'm doing it in the best way possible. I am the expert. I can do these things, I can run and manage the affairs of the community, of the life, of the state, in a way that nobody else can do. So it's very much technically driven. Now that image is the image of the German Reichstag, and it's not strange because everybody knows that the German lifestyle and the way they run the community is very precise, very exact, and it's very highly efficient. Now, when Max Weber was talking about these ideal types of authority, he was, of course, saying that it's possible to have a combination of these things. But what is very peculiar is that if you want to place the Ismaili Imam, the present Ismaili Imam, somewhere here, it would be very difficult. It's very elusive, and I'll tell you why. It defies all kinds of common images that you have. There is this kaleidoscopic quality to his leadership which makes it very difficult. Now, this is the first image. This is the image of the Ismaili Imam in his early youth when he's in a factory in East Africa. I think it's about bag-making factory in East Africa. So he's the head of a factory. It looks like an industrialist. Then we've got the image of the Imam who is in one of the nation newspapers in East Africa. So he's the owner of newspaper, of now the biggest journalistic institution in East Africa. Then we've got the image of the Imam in a primary school. This is one of the Al-Khana schools. I think it's also in East Africa. So he's looking at industry, then we've got journalism, then we've got education, primary education. Here the Imam is the chancellor of the Al-Khana University. He's wearing the robe and all these things which are associated with an academic institution, with modern academic institutions. Then we've got the figure of the image of the Imam. He's looking at the construction of the University of Central Asia, which is run under the Al-Khana Development Network. So this has got to do with architecture, with construction, with building. And then the last one is the typical image of a religious leader, which is just limited to the congregations of the community. It's an insider thing rather than an outsider thing. So you might just, if nobody knows him, run into him somewhere on the street and never recognize him. This man is just wearing a suit and a tie and he's shaving, and there's nothing else which is going to make him distinct from anybody. So there is this quality that he's wearing so many hats, and the reason that he appears like that is that his function and his role demands him to look at every single aspect of human life. So you've got academic institutions, journalism, construction, building, industry, and then the religious life of the community. So there are so many different elements about it. Now this quotation is again reinforcing the same idea that the Imam has. This was in 2003, and the Imam is talking about the history of the institution of Imamat, which goes back to the time of the Prophet, to the time of Imam Ali. And then he argues that I am to be concerned with the quality of life of the community and those amongst whom it lives. Over many centuries and decades, that responsibility of the Imamat has entailed that the creation of institutions to address issues of quality of life of the time. So you see, this idea of looking at the quality of life is something completely and absolutely central to the vision of the Ismaili Imam. And it's not just about material life. It's also about the spiritual life. It is interconnected. You cannot just separate them. Now, what happens is that with the present Ismaili Imam, there is if you like, a redefinition of the function of the Imamate. The first part of it has got to do with institutionalization. How you build these institutions for the community, for the religious life of the community, and for the wider community, which becomes the Al-Khana Development Network. Then we've got the development of a constitution. Now, the very term itself sounds rather bizarre, because if you talk about a constitution in a Western setting, it's got to do with power, with state. But this is rather different, because it's not exactly a social contract. There is an element of a covenant in it, because there is this oath of allegiance to the line of the Imamate. Then there is this engagement of the Imamate with modernity and with secularity, and I've deliberately avoided using modernism or secularism because there is a ideological bent behind it. And I haven't said embracing modernity or secularity, and I specifically meant engaging with them. And I'll explain why. Then it's important to preserve the ethical values of Islam. And it's not just Islam, it's also the element of Shiism in it. As we'll see, one of the most important aspects of the Ismaili community today is that you have to keep a balance between faith and intellect, between reason and revelation. This is a very well-known Shia tradition, particularly with Ismailism, but the background of the Fatimid rulers and the tradition of the community. Again, the Imam is highlighting the importance of creating this balance, of not just talking about absolute submission to a religious faith. You have an intellect, you've got to use it actively. Then, in the modern time, there are certain doctrinal and theological principles which are kept intact. And the most important thing is the imamat itself, the succession of the imams, which is by way of designation, by way of nas. And that nas has got two elements to it, a spiritual element and a physical element. The spiritual element is that every imam is designating the next successor spiritually. That is the spiritual meaning of it. And the physical aspect of it is that every imam has got to be descended from the previous imam. So it's the usual tradition of Shia Islam. Then when we talk about the Ismaili community, the constitution, with the promulgation of the constitution in 1986, this is the latest version. The earliest version of these constitutions, they were called rules and regulations at the time of Al Khan III. They appeared in early 20th century, 1903 to 1905. And they were basically the rules and regulations of how to run the affairs of the community, of how to organize the community, who are the leaders, how do you appoint them. But then in 1986, it brought the global Ismaili community of all parts of the world under one unified document or a framework which would rule the affairs of the community. So it was providing a system of governance for the Jamaat, an extensive economic, caring for the economic well-being of the community, the leadership capacity, and facilitating social support and welfare for those who are in need of support, which is inside the community. So the system of governance of the Jamaat is the way it is established and the way it is, the guidelines which are there is based on voluntary service. Now, a small number of these people are paid or remunerated, but the large number of them are just serving the community on a voluntary capacity. So there is a very strong element of civil society, which is so strong in the backbone of the community. Now, the structure that you see here is the structure of the community institutions. At the center of it, you've got the Imam. Then you've got the Department of Jamaati Institutions, which is at his headquarters in Aiglemont in Paris, near Paris. And then we've got the Leaders International Forum. The Leaders International Forum is composed of the president of all councils of any Ismaili territory around the globe. In any country, they've got an Ismaili council. The president of every council is a member of the Leaders International Forum. We've got the National Council in every country. Every country has got a national council, a conciliation and arbitration board, a tariqa and religious education board, and then the grants and review boards. The function of these are various. The conciliation and arbitration board has got to do basically with resolving disputes, which is some sort of a community-based judiciary system. It's not judiciary because you don't take people to the court. You sort of deal with matters in terms of arbitration without getting people involved in legal issues. And the Tariq and Religious Education Board has got to do with the religious formation and the education of the community. The Grants and Review Board is particularly important because it oversees the financial transactions in the institutions very meticulously and the management of how these guys are running the community. The Imam is at the center of it. The Institute of Ismaili Studies is providing academic and intellectual support for these institutions. But also, over the time, it is rather becoming independent in terms of the particular area of that some departments are doing research, but then a part of it is just serving the needs of the community. There is a connection between the Ismaili, the IIS and the Tariq and Religious Education Boards in terms of the community relations and how they give them scholars to support them in the day-to-day activities of the community. Then the national councils have got different boards, the Education Board, the Health Board, the Economic Planning Board, the Youth and Sports Board. As you see, if you go through them, they are sort of a counterpart for the Al Khan Development Network, but inside the community, which is enshrined within the ethics of Islam and Shia Islam and the tradition of the Ismaili community. The AKDN is more open to the outside world. So part of it, you may describe it as religious and secular. I've have decided to avoid those terms because they create a lot of misconceptions. Now, this is the image of the Imam when he was signing the Constitution in Geneva in 1986. Now, the thing I was going to say about the Constitution and the difference of this Constitution with the typical Western concept is that this Constitution is more like a covenant. See, the Constitution on the right-hand side looks like a very secular thing. Covenant, it could be a completely religious thing. The Ismaili community, the Ismaili Constitution is somewhere here in between. It's neither that one, nor completely this one. It's a covenant because there is a social contract. There are people are socially appointed to these institutions, but there is a confessional commitment to it too, because there is an oath of allegiance. They give their bay'at to the Imam of the time. But there is a minimal theological statement in it. If you look at the Ismaili Constitution, the preamble of the Constitution is basically telling them that, okay, we've got the Prophet as the final Prophet, we've got the Quran, then we've got Imam Ali and the line of the Imamat, and this Imam is descended from him. This is the context in which he interprets the faith for the community. You don't have any other theological statement in that brief one. It's only one page. It doesn't go into Ma'ad, it doesn't go into Tawheed, it doesn't go into anything thickly theological. It's very minimal in that sense. But then we've got rules and regulations, which are non-theological. They're not polemical. The rules and regulations is just having how these institutions are going to function in an ethical way, in a coherent way, in an efficient way, so that you know that the institution is really up and running properly. Then we've got a system of revenues. You've got voluntary donations by the community. You don't go knock on people's door, all right, give me your taxes or something like that. People do it completely on a voluntary basis. But then most importantly, there are rigorous measures to make sure that these funds which are given to the community are spent properly. You cannot just say that, okay, the community is trusting you, you can spend the money in any way you like. These communities themselves have got to oversee how every single penny is spent anywhere around the globe. So I'm moving to the third part, and I'm trying to wrap it up in a couple of minutes from now. So when we look at the modern world and looking at the emerging themes, there is this idea of a critical engagement with modernity, which may sound a little bit strange if then somebody looks at the AKDN. So there are a number of questions. Has the Ismaili Imamat in the community become modern or secular? It's a very typical thing. Everybody might say this about the Ismaili community. Has the Ismaili Imamat or the AKDN wholly embraced free market capitalism? This is one of the pervasive comments about the AKDN. It's actually been written. It's been spelled out in exactly the same word. That's why I put this in quotations. Free market capitalism. Does the Ismaili Imamat or the communities, does it reproduce or passively adopt Western or European models? This is again one of the common perceptions or, let's say, allegations against the Ismaili community and the Imamat, and there are responses to them. The bottom line is that there is a critical engagement on the side of the Ismaili Imamat in particular and the Ismaili Imam in person when it comes to issues which are happening in the Western world, in the European world. And there are some certain responses to various elements of European liberal democratic societies. A very common thing is this issue of freedom of speech. Now everybody expects that, okay, if Daryoush Khan is secular, is Western, is modern, he would say that, okay, freedom of speech is absolute. He never does that. On every single occasion that freedom of speech has been a pretext for attacking Islamic values or the Prophet, the Ismaili Imam has responded very clearly that freedom is not absolute. Freedom of speech, you have to respect other people's freedom. It cannot be reduced to license. On every single occasion, the Ismaili Imam has immediately responded to that. So it sets him apart. He does not think in a liberal or a neoliberal way of a Western community. I've tried to put this as responses, this slide as engagements and responses. So there are certain anomalies, if you like, if somebody says that the AKDN or Ismaili Imamat is Western, liberal, secular. And if you look at these anomalies, it will tell you that there is something deeper going on underneath it. So we've got a response to modernity. The Ismaili Imam's position to modernity is not at all like the Eurocentric or an Orientalist approach to modernity. The Orientalist approach to modernity is very simple. It's very straightforward. You can only become modern if you behave like Europeans, if you follow exactly the same history that the Europeans have had. You've got to relinquish religion, you've got to give up tradition, you've got to become completely modern, do everything they do. That is precisely what the Ismaili Imam has preached differently, has acted differently, that We have to do it in our own way, in our own language. We have to look at our own history, our own community, our own settings. You cannot just completely copy anything which is Western. You cannot lose your own values. Then this idea of being politically pro-Western. This is a very common and pervasive idea about the Ismaili Imamat. There are so many things that people do not highlight, and I've put here some of them so that you could actually. I've written some of these things in my book. There is when George Bush said that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea are parts of the axis of evil. The next day, the Ismaili Imam gave an interview that this is completely unacceptable. You cannot just stigmatize a whole civilization. Now, that there is a huge civilization going on there in Iraq, in Syria, and in Iran. You cannot just say that you're axis of evil. It's completely unacceptable. You cannot just stigmatize a whole nation like that. So that was an immediate response. If this guy was siding with the Americans, he wouldn't have responded so immediately back to the American president. Then there is issue of the invasion of Iraq. On a number of occasions, he's criticized the invasion of Iraq, that you just invaded a country, you created a mess there. Now, that you would hear from somebody with a leftist political agenda. That coming out of the mouth of the Ismaili Imam sounds bizarre, strange. But it is driven by the ethical vision of the Imam. Then we've got this issue of the freedom of speech, which I shared with you, the Danish cartoons going on. I'll put a number of things here which is sort of close to Iran. The position of the Ismaili Imam on Iran's nuclear program is strange. If somebody reads the comments that he made, they would say, okay, this looks like Ahmadinejad, but that's not what he would say. He said, look, the Iranian nation have got the right to peaceful nuclear technology. And the comments that he made was that the West is technologically colonizing Iran. And he specifically says that I have told the Iranians, I mean, there have been senior Iranian diplomats who were in touch with the Imam at that time, that this is the wise course to take. Just stay away from weaponizing things, from creating problem for yourself, but that is your right. Go ahead and do it. And we could see the outcome of that today. Then when it comes to the issue of Hamas, this is very, very strange. The interviewer is talking about the Hamas, and he says that, okay, there is this terrorist organization. The Imam refrains from using the term terrorist. And then he explains that, look, when there is a violent background to any kind of movement, the moment they engage in life, the moment they engage in politics, now the Hamas won an election. You cannot just undermine their activity. You cannot say that because you had a violent background. And he gives the example of Mandela, and he gives the example of many East African politicians who had this violent background. They said, look, they are engaged in politics. They're caring about their own lives. You cannot just call Hamas a terrorist organization right when they have actually won an election. That, again, is strange. When it comes to Ayatollah Khomeini, this was a recent interview. He says that, look, when I look at him, I was listening to his speeches. He says, I am a Shia Muslim, and I don't think there was any Shia Muslim around the globe who was not moved by what he was saying. It's not necessarily an endorsement of the Ayatollah, but what he was saying is that, look, the guy had a charismatic quality around him, and he's explaining why people were following him. If he was pro-Western politically, he would generally have spoken disparagingly about him. He never spoke disparagingly about Khomeini. There is not a single instance in which he speaks negatively about him. But clearly there are huge differences between him and Khomeini. When he talks about democracy in Iraq, the gist of it is that, look, you guys invaded a country. Now you're telling them that in Iraq the Shias have got everything in their own hand. But you knew this. You knew what democracy was about. You knew that the largest population in Iraq is Shia. And democracy is about the majority getting the power. You brought democracy to them, and now the Shias are in power. Why are you blaming them? You had a miscalculation about it. It was your fault. There is not a problem with the Shias in Iraq. They were the majority. They voted. They've won all the seats. Whatever happens is a different story. Now, this is a critique of exporting democracy. Now, all of these things, if you put them together, it doesn't give that image of a politically pro-Western Muslim leader. Now, this is a common misperception about the Ismaili Imam. It doesn't mean that the guy is a radical leftist political activist at all. He's a religious figure, of course. He doesn't speak in a controversial way, but very mildly is criticizing the same policies again. Then there's this issue of free market capitalism. Free market capitalism is that you make your money without asking any questions. You just have to make your money. It doesn't care where it comes from. If you look at the ethical framework of the Aga Khan Development Network, is that every single project which is going to be approved by the Imam has got to meet certain ethical standards. One of them is, of course, that you cannot create dependency in people. You cannot just go and make money and take the money away from that country. A free market capitalist would never tell you that. He says, okay, I go to East Africa, I create Serena Hotel, I make my own money, I go and spend it in New York. Nobody can ask you anything. But there are certain tests. If you put these to test, that perception completely falls apart. So free market capitalism, as much as it seems so appealing, because there is a lot of money there is a lot of money earned and spent, but nobody asks how you spend it and on what basis you're doing it. So this idea of free market capitalism, when you compare it with an ethical framework over there, it causes a lot of difficulties to be able to sustain that position. Now, what happens in the modern world is that there is basically a change of coordinates. There is a shift of theology, if you like, a shift of metaphysics. If you look at the history of the community, intellectually, there was a period when Neoplatonism and trying to explain faith through the lens of Greek ideas was very prominent during the Fatimid period. Then it fades away when they come to Iran during the Alamut period, when the Nazaris are there. It turns more into a Sufi way of looking at it, more esoteric, more spiritual. Ghazi and Nouman, Nasir Khusrov's style of fiqh is no longer there in this community. Today in the modern world, it's not there. So that thick and heavy metaphysics of the previous eras is now replaced by something thin and lean, in the sense that you don't have all these detailed metaphysical jurisprudential ideas about how you practice your faith. Not that it becomes redundant or irrelevant or obsolete, but this is what is happening. Instead of that sophisticated theological system, you have a network of institutions for improving the quality of life. So theology is replaced by development, by improving the quality of life. Now, this is the key word of it. So what happens is that there is a change of axis, focus, coordinates. You don't speak theologically now. You speak in the language of improving the quality of life. So the polemical language is no longer there. You never hear the Ismaili Imam saying that this man is mu'min or kafir. This man is clean or unclean. He doesn't judge people in that language. The terms halal and haram would hardly ever appear in the language of the Imam. Does that make him secular? Does that make him liberal? Not exactly. What he basically does is that he's keeping away from a polemical way of engaging with the people. So this is precisely the core of that shift of coordinates. Now, there are certain watchwords in the language of the Imam. One of them is obviously what I discussed all along, improving the quality of life. The other term for it is development. Then there are certain terms which form the very ethical and intellectual mentality and vision of the Imam. One of them is pluralism. Pluralism meaning that you cannot, in a very basic way of it, is that you cannot judge anybody, you cannot accuse anybody of being a non-Muslim because they are different from you. Because somebody is a Sunni or a Shia or a different Shia, you cannot say, okay, I'm going to go to paradise, he's going to go to hell. So pluralism is basically about allowing other people to have the same space, having the same quality of life as you are going to have. You cannot judge anybody's life in the hereafter. Then we've got this issue of humanism and intellect, that this balance between faith and intellect is absolutely critical and important. Meritocracy, that you have to have the merit, you have to be qualified to occupy a position. You cannot just say that I'm a good, faithful person, I pray regularly, I'm qualified to be the head of this organization, to manage this factory or something like that. Cosmopolitan ethics, this is one of the phrases that the Imam has been recently using, recently in the past 20 years probably, but in the past 10 years it has become more dominant. By cosmopolitan ethics, the argument of the Imam is that we need an ethical way of life which supports pluralism. And by that I mean that I'm looking for a quality of life which can be provided to every single person regardless of their faith. If you have got a non-Muslim, he's got to have exactly the same quality of life as you do. You cannot say that because I'm a Muslim, my children should go to a better school than a Christian person or an atheist person. So that cosmopolitan ethics cannot be driven solely by the ethics of a single faith, or even a faith at all. It should be humanistic. It should provide the best quality of life for every single human being without just trapping it in polemical or theological arguments. So it's basically an openness to the other. Then this is the other thing which I've described as bifocal leadership, which is what the Imam talks about, keeping a balance between deen and dunya, which is the backbone of the institutions and the vision of the Imam. That you cannot just run away from life. You have to live a good life and have a spiritual life at the same time. Now, if you ask the Ismaili Imam, he says that this is nothing strange. I'm doing it exactly in the same tradition of my forefathers. And he's often, when they ask him, he says, this is what Imam Ali did. This is what the Prophet did. I am following the same example. This is nothing liberal. This is nothing Western. This is nothing European. And the self-image that he's got is that this is an Islamic and a Shia way of life. You cannot just call it European. And it has a signature. It has the brand of the Aga Khan. Now everybody could recognize, if you look at some buildings and the constructions that the Aga Khan has, the way he runs the institutions, it has his own way of life. It is a lot inspired by his own personal vision. So now he brings a new concept of authority. This is the authority of a Shia Muslim leader in the 21st century, looking at the context in which the community lives, looking at the problems of the world today, and he's addressing these problems in every single area that the community is living in. So there is, again, I'm sort of going back to another quotation from the Imam. This was given in 1985, so he's repeating the same. You would see that this idea is dominantly there in his mind, that the idea that you could totally separate the spiritual life from material life is Christian. It comes from St. Augustine. Muslims never had this. This is not the history of Muslims. You cannot separate the material from the spiritual. And then he says that the history and the correct interpretation of the imamat requires that the imam, while caring for all of the spiritual well-being of his people, should be continuously concerned with their safety and their material progress. Now, I'm going to end here with a quotation from him from his youth. There was a conference on the Prophet's Sirat, and it sort of captures the same idea again. As you would see, it goes back to his early youth, the way he was looking at the example of the Prophet. And again, we've got his own voice here. You could read it and listen to it.
The Holy Prophet's life gives us every fundamental guideline that we require to resolve the problem as successfully as our human minds and intellects can visualize. His example of integrity, loyalty, honesty, generosity both of means and of time, his solicitude for the poor, the weak and the sick, his steadfastness in friendship, his humility in success, his magnanimity in victory, his simplicity, his wisdom in conceiving new solutions for problems which could not be solved by traditional methods without affecting the fundamental concepts of Islam. Surely, all these are foundations which, correctly understood and sincerely interpreted, must enable us to conceive what should be a truly modern and dynamic Islamic society.
Thank you very much for your patience. I'm done here.
Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We now have some time for questions, if there are any.
How many Ismailis are there in the entire world?
Well, it's a difficult question because it's not easy to give the exact figures, but the official figures tell us something around 15 million people around the globe. 15 million Ismailis. That was it.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much for the speech. I'd like to ask how people come to this sect as one of the Shias.
I mean, joining the faith.
Is that something like through generations, or there are people who convert to Ismailis?
Well, the history of Ismailism, I mean, generally before the modern times, is that there was an active da'wah, that people were recruited. The proselytization was a part of it. But in modern times, this is almost completely gone away. I mean, there is no active recruitment. I mean, if anybody wants to become an Ismaili, they're free to join the community. Of course, they have to know the history, they have to know the rituals, they have to know the background of the community. And then one of the important things is that if they're going to be accepted in the community, they've got to know whether they genuinely want to. I mean, there is no pressure. If somebody marries an Ismaili, and then there might be a pressure from the family that they want to make them join the community. And this doesn't happen, because you have to do that out of your own free will. You cannot just go and join the community because your husband or your wife is an Ismaili. So it is open, but there is no active encouragement from the institutions. Nobody says that, okay, this is the right path. Because imagine this, that if you've got an imam who's talking about pluralism, he's not going to force anybody to, okay, this is the only way of salvation. Yes, it is there in the back of any practicing Ismaili or a believing Ismaili, but there is no active recruitment or proselytization, if you like.
Any more questions?
Thank you for your explanations. How much outside funds is the Arkan Development Network able to leverage on the basis of its own contribution? Yeah, I think you mentioned some figure.
Yeah, there are some figures there. The thing is that the AKDN is it's one of the largest development agencies around the globe, and I don't remember the exact funds, but there are different institutions, there are different organizations around the globe, whether it's development organizations in Canada, in Scandinavian countries, in the United States. Ford Foundation works with the AKDN, Microsoft works with the AKDN. They share some of these funds, and the basis of making those donations and funds is that they look at the activity of the AKDN and the Ismaili Imamat institutions in various areas. Pakistan is a very good place. So they look at the Afghan Rural Support Program in northern Pakistan. They've done a phenomenal work, and they said, look, we've got an institution, a development institution, which is efficient, which they're not wasting their money, they are transparent about the way they get the money, and they spend the money, and they give us the right to report. So the reputation of the institution helps them very much in attracting those funds and leveraging them and using them in different parts of the world. So that's the mechanism in which it works. The details of it, I'm not a businessman, I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm not really into figures, but the numbers are big. They help it. But you see, there are a number of sources for the funding is important. The part of it is coming from international organizations. A part of it, I don't know how much, but it's not that big. The other part is coming from the donations of the community, not just in terms of the religious community, but the voluntary donations. The other part of it is from the donation of the community on religious basis, which is the Imamat Fund. It's the money which is paid to the Saham Imam or something like that. Now that part of it is the Imamat Fund, and the Imamat Fund is not just the money that the community, the dues that the community paid to the Imam, but also the revenues and the income of the Imam himself, because he's got his own businesses as well. So these are the three main areas where the money is actually coming from to run the institutions of the community and the development network.
Because, in 1990s, I had the chance to work with the Arkan Foundation in Geneva. And that time, by providing a core funding of, I think, $40 million, they were able to leverage another $200 million from other institutions.
Yes.
Not, obviously co-funding or, joint projects and things like that. So there was quite a very efficient, if you like, operational. Other people said, okay, we could work with you, or we could entrust our monies to you to do this job which we wanted to do. Mostly NGOs and
exactly.
bilateral institutions. And
now that still continues. I think it was a couple of years ago that Obama made the same commitment to some parts of the world. And the other thing is that because when they look at the AKDN, particularly in Afghanistan after the war and the reconstruction, the AKDN is spending a lot of money. So that amount of money was also spent in Syria. Of course, everything is completely destroyed in Syria now. So they completely did a full renovation of the Aleppo citadel, which is now in ruins after the ISIS and all these people. But so it's all across the globe, and they look at the record of these institutions, and different institutions and governments and organizations contribute to that.
I'm sure you know there used to be, or maybe still is, a very strong perception in the UK associating the Aga Khan with the horse racing. I always had difficulty understanding how that fits in with the role of a leader of a religious community.
Yes. Well, the Imam has on a number of occasions given interviews, but they regularly ask him, and he's sort of cornered about this every now and then. He explains this, that this just came to me as an accident, because it was a family business. It belonged to his father, and then when his father died, then nobody else was there to take care of it. And it was just money, and they had the horses there. So somebody had to take care of it. But the question for him is that, I mean, he was asking two questions. First of all, is it ethical or is it not ethical? He doesn't find it unethical for a religious leader to make money out of horses, out of sports or something like that. The second thing is that he always made a point that if at any given moment, looking at this horse racing thing is going to impede my activity as the Imam, my function as the Imam, and it stops anything that I do for the community, I would not give it a second thought. I would immediately set it aside. So for him, it is something which doesn't damage his role as the Imam. So it's part of it is sport, and it's nothing new. It's not just with this Aga Khan or the previous one. It was there with the Imamate for a very long time. Even before Aga Khan first came to India, he had a love of horses. Well, if somebody wants to justify it, he could go back to the Prophet and say the Prophet talked about horses and horse racing or something like that. But the people could find some sort of a religious justification for it too. But yes, that has been the case. And a part of that has primarily got to do with the way that the British society is looking at a Muslim leader as an outsider. Let's not forget that there is a very strong Orientalist perception about that. That you generally view somebody who is Oriental, somebody who is Muslim, negatively. You find any kind of excuse to do any kind of mudslinging, and it happens, and it's common. So this is very much seen in the British society rather than in other places. People don't hear that much of it in other places, because it's here, of course. The horse racing business is here in the British domains.
It's an association with gambling. Otherwise, there's really nothing wrong with horse racing or
yeah, that was the point. But
a business or a hobby in horses.
I think Aga Khan III explains this somewhere in his memoirs, that it's got nothing to do with gambling. I'm not gambling on it. I don't do any kind of gambling. So I don't know much about the technical details or the juristical aspects of it, of how a jurist might understand it, but there is a difference of opinion. Not every jurist, not every faqih would call that gambling. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, and I think what Aga Khan does is quite commendable. However, and I also went to Aga Khan school, and I also met the Aga Khan myself when he came to when I was young. What puzzles me is there are a lot of basic fundamentals of Islam, like praying, fasting. He has evolved and not made compulsory for his people. Is there any reasoning he has given why has that happened, or?
Well, so this is basically a question of rituals, okay? As far as the issue of rituals is concerned, nobody has said that this is not compulsory. A part of it is because the way you practice your faith is something which entirely depends on you as an individual, of how you commit yourself to worship of God. The second thing is that a part of that has evolved historically in the Ismaili community, because the Ismailis are esotericists. Now, I often give this explanation to my students that 7-8 centuries ago, when Tusi was writing this famous treatise for the Ismailis, the Paradise of Submission, there's a passage in that in which he explains that the difference between the age of Shariat and the age of Qiyamah. And he says that the age of Shariat is a period in which worshipping is bound by time and space. You give time, you give space for it. For example, you pray 5 times, 3 times, 7 times, 8 times a day. There are specific times for it. Or you fast in a particular month, or you go to Hajj in a particular time. But the worship of the age of Qiyamah, the esoteric worship, is that you just lift that limit, not making it redundant, but making it even bigger and stronger. So if you pray, if you used to pray 5 times a day during the age of Shariat, now you pray continuously, and then it resonates with that verse of the Quran, الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَلَىٰ صَلَاتِهِمْ دَائِمُونَ. You constantly pray. And you don't fast only for 1 month. You constantly fast. Now, that sounds like a theological statement or some sort of an esoteric interpretation of it, but as far as the reality is concerned, many Ismailis do fast regularly, the entire month of Ramadan. The format is different. They don't exactly follow certain jurisprudential aspect of it for a very simple reason, that the Ismaili community has never ever in its entire history produced any faqihs like that. The only exception being the case of Ghazi al-Nu'man during the Fatimid period, which was connected with the empire. The state building required a legal framework for it. Otherwise, before that and after that, because of the presence of the living imam, you don't have any faqih. And then it's at the discretion of the imam telling the community how you should worship. Now, does the Ismaili community worship? Yes, they do. Everybody knows this. They regularly go to their places of congregation, to their Jamaat khanas, and they have their own prayers. The prayer is in Arabic. It begins with exactly the same verses and chapters of the Quran that everybody else prays. The format is almost exactly the same. There are slight differences. They don't do it like other Muslims. But does it stop an Ismaili from doing the prayer like any other Muslim does? No, it doesn't. In fact, there is no active discouragement of anybody doing that. But the foundation of faith is not just the rituals. I mean, even if you ask the Prophet, if you go back to the story of the changing of the Qibla, the Quran is very explicit about this. That we changed the Qibla not because we wanted to say that there is a particular value in Mecca, and that value is not there in Baytul Muqaddas. The fundamental issue was to see who is actually following you, who submits to you, who surrenders to you. It was the centrality of the figure of the Prophet which was important. So it's not just a ritual. There's something more important, much deeper than that. So that comes from the tradition of the community in that esoteric understanding of it. And it's out there in the tradition. It's in the Quran. You see, a part of that is very much engendered by a perception, today particularly in the 20th century, that being a Muslim is very much tied to following certain rituals. The history of the Ismaili community tells us a completely different story, because it's not just about rituals. There's something far deeper than that. Because if you look at the rituals, how many people know whether the Prophet prayed exactly in the same way that we do today? You don't know that. It's constructed. 100 and 200 years later, we were given this image that this is the way the Prophet prayed. And it developed through time, it developed through history, that we assume that this is the way of Islam. So just staying even outside the Ismaili community, that whole idea is also problematic. It could be challenged. I think in the inauguration of his Golden Jubilee, the President Imam was saying that I am developing a text for the namaz for Ismailis, that if they want to share the same space of congregation and worship with other Muslims, they could do it. They could use the same text. So there is no active discouragement of anything to do with the Sharia side of the Islamic faith.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Someone I heard speaking about the Amman message before, which is a document you may have come across, where Muslims from different sects have signed up to say that this is the fundamentals of Islam. And they were asked why the Ismailis want a part of that. And the response was, and I wonder if you agree, that the Ismailis weren't really wanting to be part of that. And
I think in the Amman message, they are actually part of it, because His Highness sends the message and it's included there in the Amman conference. Okay. So it's in other places. I think the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, it used to have a different name. They always had these differences, and a part of it is political, obviously, because we know that organization is politically oriented. It's not just about a faith-based community, it's about the Islamic states. So there are certain differences, but that tendency isn't new. And it's not just about Ismailis. If you look at the history of Muslim communities, the Shias were generally viewed negatively by the larger Muslim parts of the Muslim community. The Sunnis were calling the Shias Rafidi, in exactly the same way that the Shias were calling them Nasibi. So that was there. So it's about accepting people as, because the bottom line, this is a very important question. Who do you call a Muslim? On what ground are you allowed to call somebody a Muslim? Now, if you ask an Ismaili, the Ismaili Imam will tell you that, look, we are Muslim precisely for the same reason that we accept the Kalimatain, we say the Shahadatain, and that's what the Prophet would do. To the Prophet, Muawiyah was a Muslim. What gives you the right to calling him a non-Muslim? So you see, a part of that is built on a perception that you add many, many more layers and more conditions for calling somebody a Muslim. But the Ismaili Imam would tell you that this is not what the Prophet did. That is the perception of a pluralist leader who would tell you that as long as you accept the unity of God, as long as you accept the finality of the Prophet, and that this Quran is the final book of God, and this is what we profess and what we believe, and we have always believed, you are a Muslim. You may have different views and details of it, of how you practice your faith, of what was your history, of what was your political affiliations to this or that state, but as far as God is concerned, as far as the Quran is concerned, all of these guys say La ilaha illallah, and they do it regularly, every morning and every evening. The number of times that any Ismaili around the globe repeats those phrases is not less than any other Muslim. So if it is about the La ilaha illallah, if it is about Muhammadun Rasulullah, if it is about Ali being the Imam, they share it with everybody. So if you want to be a little bit realistic or a little bit critical about it, there are political issues at stake. And it's always been like that. It's not just about the 20th century. If you go back 5 centuries ago, we had the same issue. And it's not just about the Ismaili community.
I have a question in terms of dietary requirements. What is termed as halal in Ismaili religion?
Well, the Ismailis don't eat pork. I mean, that is what the Imam regularly practices. They don't eat pork, they don't drink alcohol. I mean, they're not supposed to be drinking alcohol. But if you want to go down the actual realities of how communities do, there are many Muslims around the globe. It doesn't matter whether they're Shias or Sunnis. They drink alcohol, they don't fast, they sometimes eat pork. But if you want to ask what is the position of the Ismaili Imam about these things, the position of the Ismaili Imam is basically and fundamentally what the Quran says. You don't drink alcohol, you don't eat pork. And it's minimal. But the thing is that does it go into so many details of how is that halal meat that people have? That is an emerging issue which has got to do with Western societies rather than, I don't know, in Iran and Ismailis, well, typically nobody asks whether this meat is halal or haram because everybody is eating the same food. It doesn't probably happen in Pakistan. It probably doesn't happen in East Africa. But if you come to London, then it's not just about Ismailism. I remember that Imam Musa Asad said this on a number of occasions, that any meat which is produced by a Christian or a Jew, you don't ask questions. It's halal for you. It's automatically halal. But it's just the approaches and the practices of different jurists who actually do it. Does the Ismaili Imam behave very pedantically about it? As far as I have seen, no.
Okay, I think we'll end there. Muhammad wa al Muhammad salawat.
No,